Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Right, and we've got a lot of ground to cover today.
We really do, because, well, when you look at the landscape of modern burnout, it usually isn't this sudden, massive explosion,
Yeah, rarely. It's more of a slow fade.
Exactly. It's this slow, grinding erosion of your conviction. You start a project or a new career or maybe even just a personal journey of character development, right?
Yeah.
And you start with immense clarity.
No, absolutely. You're completely fired up at the beginning.
But then the world pushes back, the culture mocks you, or, the visible results just completely refuse to materialize.
Which is incredibly frustrating.
Right. And the social cost of your convictions starts to isolate you. And eventually, the exhaustion just sets in. The temptation to quietly abandon your principles and slip back into whatever is safe, whatever is culturally approved, it just becomes overwhelming.
Yeah, and that slow erosion of conviction, that's precisely the crisis driving the source material we are examining today.
So we're diving into the biblical book of Hebrews, right?
Yes, specifically the closing chapters 11 through 13. And to understand it, you have to look at the original audience.
The first century Hebrew Christians.
Exactly. The author is writing to a community that is living the ancient equivalent of that exact burnout you just described. I mean, they are facing severe social exclusion.
Which was a big deal back then. Your community was your survival.
Oh, your community was everything. They're facing economic marginalization and this very real looming threat of physical persecution. So the pressure to just conform, it's enormous.
Right, because their old religious system, traditional Judaism, that was legally protected by the Roman Empire, wasn't it?
It was. It was established. It was safe. It was familiar. But this new path they had chosen, this early Christian path, it was dangerous. It was illegal, essentially.
Man, the temptation to relapse into safety must have been incredibly seductive.
Totally. You can almost feel the exhaustion in the text. They just wanted to go back to what was easy.
And that makes this ancient text deeply relevant to anyone today, right?
Yeah.
If you're listening and you're trying to hold on to a difficult conviction in a hostile environment, this is for you.
Yeah, we are going to treat this text as basically a manual for survival.
That's the mission for this deep dive. We want to extract the mechanisms of endurance. Like, how do you maintain belief when every visible metric around you says that you're being foolish?
And how do you process deep suffering without letting it curdle into bitterness? That's a huge theme here.
So where does the author start? Because he can't just give them, a superficial pep talk at this point.
No, pep talk wouldn't work. He realizes he has to completely rebuild their psychological and spiritual foundation from the ground up.
Right, he has to redefine the fundamental tool of survival itself.
Exactly, and the text identifies that tool as faith. But, and this is crucial, he defines it in a way that aggressively counters how we use that word today.
Yeah, chapter 11 opens with this monumental definition, right? Let me just read it. It says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen."
Right, the substance and the evidence.
Let me stop you there, actually, because the modern allergy to the word faith is profound.
Oh, it's a heavily loaded word today.
It really is. In our current cultural lexicon, faith is almost universally treated as a suspension of critical thinking.
Like a blind leap in the dark.
Yeah, it's framed as the absence of evidence. It's the thing you rely on when you literally run out of data. The modern skeptic hears faith and just thinks of blind wishing, or like a cognitive shortcut to comfort.
But look at the words the text actually uses. Substance. Evidence.
Right, it's the exact opposite of wishing.
The contrast is jarring, and it's intentionally so. There's a brilliant linguistic breakdown of the Greek word translated as substance here, provided by the commentator Albert Barnes.
Oh, I love this part. The Greek word is hypostasis, right?
Yes, hypostasis. It literally means that which is placed under, like a substructure or a foundation, a basis.
So it's something solid.
Very solid. Barnes argues that in this context, faith is not a feeling. It's not a blind leap. It's a cognitive and spiritual mechanism that gives actual, concrete reality to the unseen.
It treats an unseen reality as a definitive fact that dictates your behavior.
Precisely. It gives the future reality weight in the present.
If we translate that out of the theological abstract for a second, it sounds remarkably like reading an architect's blueprint.
That's a great way to put it, a blueprint.
Like when you unroll a blueprint on an empty plot of dirt, the house is completely invisible, right?
It's just dirt and weeds.
Exactly. You can't walk through the front door. You can't turn on the lights. You can't shelter from the rain. But no rational person looks at an architect's blueprint and calls it a fairy tale or a blind wish.
No, you'd sound ridiculous if you did that.
Right. The blueprint is the hypostasis. It's the foundational evidence that dictates exactly where you pour the concrete and where you lay the plumbing.
You are acting in the present, based entirely on the substantial reality of a future you can't see yet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That captures the mechanics of it perfectly.
Barnes uses a similar, highly practical analogy, actually. He notes that if you believe a distant city, say London, exists even if you've never traveled there.
Even if you've never seen it with your own eyes.
Right. That belief is not passive. It compels action. Because you treat the unseen city as a concrete reality, what do? You pack your bags, you purchase a ticket, and you board a plane or a vessel.
The belief gives all the force of reality to the unseen destination. It alters your immediate physical decisions today.
And that's what the author of Hebrews is arguing. Faith is the blueprint that dictates the architecture of a human life.
And the text doesn't just leave that as some, philosophical theory. It immediately launches into what is often called the cloud of witnesses.
Yes, this massive, sweeping historical masterclass.
It's like the Hall of Fame of faith. The author lines up these towering figures from antiquity, not just to celebrate them, but to forensically examine how they read the blueprint and survived.
It really is a series of case studies in treating the unseen as real. And the first case study he brings up is Abel.
Right, from Genesis. The text says, "By faith, Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous."
Now, what's interesting is if you look back at the original Genesis narrative, the text there doesn't explicitly use the word faith to explain why Abel's sacrifice was accepted while his brother Cain's was rejected.
Yeah, it just says God respected Abel's offering and not Cain's. It doesn't give a lot of psychological detail.
But Hebrews provides the interpretive key here. The distinction wasn't merely liturgical. It wasn't just about what they put on the altar. It was the posture of the heart.
So Abel operated from a conviction of unseen realities, whereas Cain was just going through the motions.
Exactly. Cain operated from mere ritual obligation. But the most fascinating detail about Abel in this text is the phrase, "By it he being dead yet speaketh."
That part always gets me. Abel was murdered by his brother. He is literally the first recorded victim of violence in human history.
Right. By any earthly metric, his life was a catastrophic failure.
Cain had the physical dominance. Cain retained his life. Abel's life was cut violently short. But the text claims Abel is the one who still possesses a voice.
Barnes leans heavily into that paradox. He observes that true piety embalms a legacy.
Embalms a legacy. That's a powerful phrase.
It is. Because from a purely cynical, worldly perspective, the person with the most violent power dictates history, right? Might makes right.
Right. History is written by the victors.
But the author of Hebrews is arguing for a reality that supersedes physical dominance. The commentator Matthew Henry expands on this too.
What did you say?
He suggests that faith possesses both retroactive and proactive power. It connects a finite, fragile human life to the eternal nature of God.
Meaning your actions begin to echo through time in ways you just can't control or foresee.
Exactly. Abel's physical voice was silenced in the dirt, but the testimony of his faith became a permanent structural pillar in the history of human theology.
Wow. That completely reframes how we measure the success of a life, doesn't it? We are so obsessed with immediate impact and metrics, but Abel's impact is entirely posthumous and eternal.
It really challenges our modern obsession with visible success.
For sure. And then the text moves from the first martyr to a figure who avoided death altogether, which is a wild pivot, Enoch.
Yes, the account of Enoch is brief but incredibly dense. Hebrews says, "By faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found because God had translated him. For before his translation he had this testimony that he pleased God."
Okay, so the concept of being translated, basically taken directly from Earth without experiencing physical death, that is super difficult for the modern mind to process.
It definitely is. It sounds like science fiction to us.
Right. But looking past the supernatural mechanics of it, what is the practical psychological wisdom we are supposed to extract from Enoch's life?
To understand Enoch, you really have to reconstruct his environment. Barnes provides vital context here. Enoch lived in the generations preceding the Great Flood.
Okay, so an era characterized in the text by profound systemic wickedness.
Yes. And Barnes suggests that in such a dominant, secularized culture, the prevailing philosophical consensus would have vehemently mocked the idea of divine accountability.
They probably argued that physical death was the absolute end, right? Like an eternal sleep.
Exactly. The concept of an unseen God observing human behavior and maintaining a future state of justice would have been treated as primitive superstition, kind of like how it's treated in many circles today.
So Enoch isn't just like a quiet guy who lived a good life in a vacuum. He is a profound nonconformist.
He is walking in total opposition to the cultural and philosophical consensus of his entire civilization.
He treated the unseen God as his primary reality, while literally everyone around him treated the visible material world as the only reality.
And the text explicitly links this to the definition of faith in verse 6. It says, "For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him."
So Enoch's translation wasn't just a personal reward for being a good guy.
No, it was a cosmic vindication. By removing Enoch from the earth, God shattered the cultural consensus of the era.
He provided undeniable proof to a scoffing world that the unseen realm and the future state were absolute realities.
Which takes immense psychological fortitude to endure the mockery of an entire society based purely on an unseen reality.
Which makes the next figure the ultimate study in sustained cognitive dissonance. I'm talking about Noah.
Noah is such a powerful example.
The text says, "By faith, Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house."
Noah is the ultimate test of the blueprint analogy we talked about earlier.
Oh, absolutely. The divine warning he receives concerns a global deluge, a flood. But according to the timeline in Genesis, this warning arrived 120 years before a single drop of rain fell.
120 years. Just think about that.
The duration is what completely breaks our modern understanding of motivation. I mean, human psychology is deeply dependent on feedback loops, you know?
We need to see progress.
Right. You work for 2 weeks, you receive a paycheck, you diet for a month, you see a change on the scale. We require visible, incremental validation to maintain any kind of sustained effort.
And Noah gets none of that.
Zero. Noah receives an invisible warning, and then he goes to work building a massive maritime vessel on dry land for over a century in a complete vacuum of environmental confirmation.
It's astounding. Barnes paints a vivid picture of the sheer absurdity of Noah's task from a purely empirical standpoint.
What does he point out?
Barnes notes that the course of nature had been unbroken and uniform for 16 centuries up to that point. The laws of nature appeared entirely stable.
So the idea of the entire globe being submerged in water was, according to the scientific and observational data of that era, preposterous.
Exactly. Noah could not point to any geological or meteorological evidence to justify his massive expenditure of time and resources. All he possessed was the invisible word of God.
Imagine the social cost of that. I mean, he isn't building this in secret in his basement. A project of that scale is the center of public attention.
It would have been the biggest spectacle around.
For over a century, he is the subject of crushing ridicule. He is the punchline of every joke. The philosophers scoff at his lack of evidence. The pragmatists mock his waste of lumber.
And he has to wake up every single morning, face that public humiliation, and continue swinging the hammer.
Matthew Henry provides a fascinating insight into what fueled that daily hammer swing, actually.
Oh, about being moved with fear?
Yeah. He notes that Noah was moved with fear, but Henry clarifies, this is not a paralyzing terror. It's not a panic attack.
Right, it's a calibrated godly reverence.
Noah weighed the word of the invisible God against the combined mockery of the visible world, and he determined that God's word carried infinitely more weight.
His faith was not a passive intellectual agreement. It was an active, decades-long resistance to the prevailing narrative.
And the text says that by this action, he condemned the world. The sheer contrast of his diligent preparation exposed the profound apathy of his contemporaries.
If we pull that into a modern translation, Noah is the ultimate example of decoupling your behavior from the need for social validation.
Yes. He didn't need the culture to agree with him, and he didn't need nature to provide immediate proof. He anchored his reality strictly to the unseen.
And from Noah, the text moves to the patriarchal era, focusing heavily on Abraham and his wife, Sarah. Abraham is universally recognized as the father of the faithful.
So how does his case study advance the author's argument here? What's his specific angle?
Abraham introduces the element of radical displacement. Hebrews records, By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for inheritance, obeyed. And he went out, not knowing whither he went.
So he didn't even have a map.
No map. And remember, Abraham belonged to a settled, advanced civilization in Mesopotamia. He had a secure home, a massive inheritance, deep familial roots.
He had it made.
He did. The divine call demanded that he sever all those visible securities and journey toward an unspecified destination.
And the text highlights that even when he arrived in the Promised Land, he didn't settle down and build a mansion. He lived in temporary tents.
Right. He deliberately maintained the lifestyle of a nomad.
He possessed the wealth to build a permanent estate, but he stayed a stranger and pilgrim alongside his son Isaac and grandson Jacob.
The author of Hebrews explains the psychology behind that nomadic existence. He says, "For he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God."
So Abraham understood that the physical land of Canaan was merely a shadow of a much greater reality.
Exactly. He refused to trade the ultimate promise for immediate comfort. He traded a visible, temporary city in the present for an invisible, permanent city in the future.
And Sarah's inclusion is equally vital here, specifically regarding the promise of an heir.
The biological impossibility of it.
Right. The text notes she received strength to conceive a child far beyond the natural age of childbearing. And the mechanism for this biological miracle is explicitly tied to her mental state. It says, because she judged him faithful who had promised.
It is a remarkable cognitive pivot because, when Sarah initially heard the promise in the Genesis account, she literally laughed out loud.
It defied biology. It was absurd to her.
But Hebrews focuses on her ultimate posture. She bypassed the visible limitations of her own biology and anchored her expectation entirely to the character of the invisible God.
Her faith was the substructure that allowed the impossible to materialize.
And this theme of trading the immediate for the ultimate reaches its absolute peak with the profile of Moses.
Oh, this is arguably the most politically and economically charged example in the entire chapter.
Without a doubt, the text reads, "By faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season."
The stakes here are astronomical. I mean, Moses was situated at the absolute apex of the global hierarchy. He was raised in the court of Pharaoh, the dominant superpower of the ancient world.
He had unrestricted access to unimaginable wealth, elite education, political influence, absolute security.
And he voluntarily incinerates all of it.
He burns it all down.
He looks at the highest peak of human achievement, and then he looks at a brutalized, enslaved population of Hebrew laborers, and he chooses to identify with the slaves.
The sheer irrationality of that choice, from a worldly perspective, is staggering. Why would anyone forfeit an empire to join a chain gang?
The author provides the economic logic of faith in the very next verse, doesn't he?
Yes. It says, "Esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had a respect unto the recompense of the reward."
Matthew Henry offers a brilliant analysis of this internal calculation. He suggests Moses essentially used a spiritual scale.
Right. A set of scales to weigh his options.
Yeah. On one side of the scale, he plays the absolute worst aspects of faithfulness to God: poverty, exile, reproach, and affliction.
All the heavy stuff.
And on the other side of the scale, he plays the absolute best the material one had to offer: the treasures, the pleasures, and the political power of Egypt.
And the invisible reality outweighed the empire.
Completely.
Precisely. Because Moses factored in the variable of time. The text explicitly notes that the pleasures of Egypt were for a season.
They were finite. They had an expiration date.
Right. But the unseen reward was eternal. Moses possessed the capacity to see past the immediate sensory data of gold and power, recognizing it as ultimately hollow compared to the enduring reality of the divine promise.
He endured, the text says, as seeing him who is invisible.
But right as the author builds this towering crescendo of victorious heroes, he introduces a massive, deeply uncomfortable obstacle.
Yeah, this part is a gut punch. After listing all these triumphs of endurance, the end of chapter 11 delivers a brutal reality check. Verse 39 says, "And these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise."
It is one of the most sobering lines in the entire text. It forces the reader to confront a terrifying possibility.
That you might do all the work and never see the reward.
Yes. Abraham never saw the great nation materialize. He only saw one son. Noah saw the flood, but the subsequent world was still deeply broken.
Moses led the people to the edge of the promised land, but he died before he could cross the river.
They spent their entire lives pouring concrete, according to the blueprint, but they never got to cut the ribbon at the grand opening.
If you bring that into our modern context, it strikes at the very heart of our cultural operating system. I mean, we are entirely conditioned for instant gratification.
We want the 30-day life hack.
Exactly. We expect immediate returns on our investments, whether they're financial, emotional, or spiritual. If we put in the work, we demand to see the results.
Today. We want them today.
But the profound countercultural wisdom of Hebrews 11 is that a truly meaningful, purpose-driven life might be spent building something you will never see finished.
It is the cathedral builder mindset.
Explain that.
Well, the architects and masons who laid the foundations of the great European cathedrals, they knew they would be dead centuries before the final spire was erected.
They knew they'd never see it completed.
Exactly. Their faith was in the continuity of the project. The author of Hebrews argues that God provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect.
So the ancient heroes laid the foundation, but the completion of the project required the endurance of the current generation.
Right. It's a relay race across centuries.
So if you are listening to this right now, maybe on your commute, or sitting at a desk feeling utterly burned out because your efforts aren't yielding immediate fruit, this text is speaking directly to you.
What is the invisible architecture you are trying to build?
It might be a deeply ingrained character trait, like achieving genuine emotional sobriety. It might be repairing a fractured generational dynamic in your family, knowing the full healing might not happen until your grandchildren are adults.
Or it might be building a culture of integrity in a deeply corrupt industry.
Yeah. The challenge of this text is asking, are you willing to do the grueling, unglamorous work of laying the foundation, even if you die before the cathedral is finished?
And that tension is exactly why the author cannot just end the letter there. He has established the historical precedent, but now he has to translate that history into immediate action.
Right, he pivots sharply in chapter 12. He takes the camera off the ancient heroes and points it directly at the exhausted, persecuted readers.
The transition here is incredibly dynamic. We move from the history books straight onto the gravel of an Olympic track.
Let me read it. Hebrews 12, verse 1. Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us.
The shift in imagery is masterful. Matthew Henry points out that the author is heavily utilizing gymnastic style.
Like metaphors directly pulled from the Greco-Roman athletic games.
Yes, the reader is suddenly thrust into the center of a massive stadium. The cloud of witnesses refers back to Abel, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and the rest.
But they're not just passive spectators.
Right. No, the Greek word for witness here implies that their very lives are providing testimony. They ran their lap, they survived, and now they are in the bleachers, and their historical endurance is meant to fuel the current runner.
That's amazing. And the coach's pre-race instruction is deeply specific here. It contains a distinction that is incredibly easy to miss. The runner is commanded to lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us. Those are two distinct categories.
Yes. The differentiation is critical for practical application. A sin is a direct violation of moral law. It is fundamentally contrary to the nature of God.
But a weight is a completely different mechanism of failure.
How would you describe the difference?
If we use a modern analogy, a besetting sin, the text says it easily entangles us. That is like trying to run a marathon with your shoelaces tightly knotted together.
It's an act of sabotage.
Exactly. It will trip you up the moment you try to move forward. But a weight. A heavy winter coat is not evil. It's perfectly legal and even culturally appropriate to own a thick winter coat. But if you attempt to run a competitive sprint while wearing a winter coat, you will fail. Not because the coat is immoral, but because it is an unbearable encumbrance.
Barnes provides an excellent analysis of the terminology here. He notes that the Greek word for the besetting sin evokes the image of a long, flowing, ornamental garment that winds around the limbs.
So an ancient athlete would strip down to the absolute bare minimum to avoid being entangled by their own clothing.
Right. But regarding the weights, Barnes gets incredibly granular. He suggests that even a perfectly legitimate attachment, a feather or a ring, as he puts it, if it occupies too much the runner's attention, becomes a psychological weight that stalls progress.
Wow. That is a diagnostic tool that cuts right through our modern rationalizations.
It really does.
Because when we examine our lives, we usually only look for the fins.
Right.
We ask, is this habit strictly illegal? Is this relationship morally prohibited?
And if the answer is no, we assume it's totally fine.
Exactly. But the text forces a much more rigorous standard. It asks, is this helping you run?
The question shifts from mere legality to ultimate utility. Is your obsession with climbing the corporate ladder a sin? Perhaps not. But is it a weight that is exhausting your capacity to be present with your family or pursue your spiritual development?
Right. Or is your perfectly curated social media feed a sin? Probably not.
But is the 3 hours of doom scrolling a heavy winter coat that is smothering your mental clarity?
Man, that hits close to home. To run the race set before you, you have to aggressively curate your life. You have to discard anything that drains your endurance, regardless of how culturally acceptable it might be.
And once the weights are dropped, the runner has to know where to focus, because you cannot run a race staring at your own feet.
And you can't run looking back at the crowd and the bleachers either.
Exactly. The text directs the gaze forward, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God.
So the author presents Jesus not merely as a theological savior, but as the ultimate pragmatic exemplar of endurance.
Because the readers are facing intense hostility, the author points them to the one who endured the ultimate contradiction of sinners against himself.
Jesus faced horrific physical torture and public, agonizing humiliation on the cross. But the key insight is how he processed that trauma.
Yes. Look at the psychological framing in that verse. For the joy that was set before him.
That is astonishing. He didn't endure the trauma by pretending it didn't hurt. He endured it by anchoring his mind to a future reality that was so immensely joyful, it mathematically overpowered the present agony.
It almost echoes the core tenets of modern sports psychology or even Stoic philosophy.
It really does. An elite athlete survives the brutal, lung-burning agony of training because their mind is entirely fixated on the podium.
The present pain is contextualized and therefore made bearable by the transcendent future victory. The text says Jesus despised the shame.
Now, that doesn't mean he hated it in a reactive, emotional sense, does it?
No, it means he thought little of it. He refused to let the immediate public humiliation define his reality because his eyes were locked on the eternal joy of redemption and his exaltation at the right hand of God.
The instruction to the exhausted reader is so simple. When you are fainting in your mind, calibrate your focus to his.
But even with the right focus, the pain of the race is undeniable. The hostility the original readers were facing was real, and the pain we face in our modern lives, career collapses, chronic illness, betrayals, it's devastating.
The text doesn't shy away from this at all. It leans right into it. Which brings us to one of the most culturally difficult passages in the entire book. Hebrews 12 begins to reframe this intense hardship as the discipline of a father.
The author anticipates the despair of his audience, and he introduces a radical paradigm shift. He actually quotes the Old Testament book of Proverbs to them.
What does he quote?
My son, despise not thou the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when thou art rebuked of him. For whom the Lord loveth he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth.
Okay, we have to apply massive discernment right here, because to the modern ear, this language is deeply triggering.
Very much so.
The imagery of a father chastising or scourging a child sounds abusive. It evokes toxic parenting, physical trauma, arbitrary cruelty. If a human father acted the way this text seems to portray God, we would call Child Protective Services.
That resistance is entirely valid, given the prevalence of human trauma. But we must carefully differentiate the text's enduring theological wisdom from the flawed, broken nature of human parenting.
And the brilliance of the author of Hebrews is that he explicitly makes this exact distinction within the text itself, doesn't he?
Yes, he anticipates the exact objection you just made. In verses 9 and 10, the author draws a sharp contrast. He acknowledges our earthly parents, the fathers of our flesh.
And what does he say about them?
He notes that they disciplined us after their own pleasure, or as it is better understood in context, according to their own flawed judgment.
Because human discipline is incredibly messy.
It is often tainted by the parent's own emotional baggage, loss of temper, ego, or arbitrary anger. A human parent might strike a child simply because the parent had a really bad day at work.
But the text argues the Father of Spirits operates on a completely different paradigm.
Entirely different. The text asserts that divine discipline is never arbitrary. It is never driven by a divine loss of temper. It is executed strictly for our profit, that we might be partakers of his holiness.
So it's purposeful?
Exactly. Barnes emphasizes that the Greek word used here for chastening paideia does not primarily mean punitive punishment. It refers to education, training, instruction, and correction.
So the afflictions are not random cruelty. They are highly calibrated, intentional training exercises.
Yes.
If we translate payday into a modern context, we shouldn't view God as an abusive parent wielding a belt. We should view him as an elite, uncompromising athletic trainer.
Oh, that's a brilliant way to frame it.
Right. Like when a master trainer puts another 40 pounds on your barbell, it isn't because he hates you and wants to crush your spine.
No, he adds the weight precisely because he sees your ultimate potential.
And he knows the only biological mechanism for building muscle requires tearing down the existing tissue through intense resistance.
That is the exact logic of verse 11. The author is remarkably honest here. He writes, "Now no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby."
So the text absolutely validates your pain.
Yeah.
It doesn't demand toxic positivity.
Not at all. It agrees that the barbell is heavy and the workout is agonizing, but it promises that the resistance is producing a specific fruit that cannot be acquired any other way.
If we can actually internalize that paradigm shift, it fundamentally changes how we navigate suffering.
It changes everything.
When a massive setback hits a financial ruin, a devastating rejection, a failure of a project, our default human instinct is to play the victim.
We cry out, "Why is this happening to me? What did I do to deserve this punishment?"
But if this text is true, the entire question is wrong.
Reframing the pain shifts your perspective. Instead of asking why you are being punished, you begin to ask, what is this resistance training me for?
Wow, what is this training me for?
Is this agonizing delay training my capacity for deep patience? Is this humiliating failure dismantling my ego to build genuine resilience? Is this profound heartbreak expanding my capacity for empathy?
The text says this realization allows you to lift up the hands which hang down and the feeble knees. It restores your agency.
You are no longer a passive victim of a cruel universe. You are an active participant in a divine training program.
But the author also issues a severe warning here.
Yeah.
Because if you reject the training, if you refuse to reframe the pain and simply allow the exhaustion to turn into resentment, you risk losing everything.
Which transitions into the danger of drifting, illustrated by one of the most tragic figures in the ancient world, Esau.
Let's talk about Esau.
The warning in verse 15 is urgent. The author tells them to look diligently, lest any man fail of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled.
And then he points to Esau as the ultimate cautionary tale. He describes him as a profane person, as Esau, who for one morsel of meat sold his birthright.
The story of Esau in Genesis is fascinating, but it often feels overly harsh to modern readers.
Yeah, Esau comes in from hunting. He is physically exhausted, his blood sugar's crashing, and he asks his brother Jacob for some stew.
And Jacob extorts him, demanding Esau's birthright in exchange for the meal. Esau agrees, eats the stew, and loses his inheritance.
We read that and think, the guy was just hungry. Isn't calling him profane a bit extreme?
To understand the severity of the judgment, we have to understand what the birthright represented in the ancient Near East. It was not just a slightly larger share of the inheritance.
What did it actually mean?
It was the leadership of the family, the priestly authority of the clan, and crucially, it was the direct link to the covenant promises God made to Abraham. It was the supreme spiritual and social asset a person could possess.
And Esau traded that eternal generational architecture for a bowl of soup that kept him full for perhaps 4 hours.
When you frame it like that, it ceases to be an ancient history lesson and becomes a brutal mirror for modern behavior. Because we are Esau.
We really are. We do this constantly.
We are biologically wired to prioritize the immediate over the ultimate.
We trade the long-term health of our bodies for the immediate dopamine hit of processed sugar or alcohol. We trade the profound, slow-building trust of a faithful marriage for the fleeting 10-minute thrill of an affair.
We trade our professional integrity and our reputation for a quick financial shortcut.
We trade deep, contemplative peace for 3 hours of mindless scrolling because we crave the immediate distraction. We are perpetually selling our birthright for a bowl of stew.
And the tragedy of that transaction is captured in verse 17. The author reminds them that afterward, when Esau finally realized the catastrophic nature of his trade and wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected.
For he found no place of repentance, though he sought it carefully with tears.
Matthew Henry points out the chilling finality of this. Esau didn't weep because he underwent a genuine moral transformation. He wept because he wanted to escape the consequences of his actions.
But the temporal trade had permanent, compounding consequences that could not be reversed by regret.
The warning to the exhausted first-century Christians and to us is clear. Do not let the immediate pressure of the culture trick you into trading your eternal inheritance for a temporary moment of relief.
And the author identifies the mechanism that causes this failure, the root of bitterness.
That botanical metaphor is highly intentional. A root operates underground, invisible to the naked eye.
Bitterness doesn't start as an explosion, right? It starts as a quiet, subterranean narrative.
It is the slow accumulation of unresolved resentments, the feeling that the training is unfair, the belief that the blueprint is a lie.
And Henry notes that when that root finally breaks the surface, it doesn't just poison the individual, it is contagious.
The text says, "Thereby many be defiled." A bitter, cynical person in a community, a workplace, or a family acts as a toxin, spreading the infection of despair to everyone around them.
To counter this terrifying possibility of failure, the author deploys the absolute climax of his argument. He constructs a massive cinematic contrast between two mountains.
This is the theological peak of the entire letter. It's designed to remind them exactly what they have inherited and why they cannot abandon it.
It is a masterclass in ancient rhetoric, isn't it?
He draws a stark line between Mount Sinai, representing the Old Covenant and the Law of Moses, and Mount Zion, representing the New Covenant and the grace of Christ.
The sensory details he uses to describe Sinai are genuinely terrifying. He reminds the Hebrew readers of their own historical origin story. When God delivered the law to Moses, the mountain was a place of absolute dread.
The text describes it as a mountain that could be touched, but doing so meant instant death.
It burned with fire, it was covered in blackness, darkness, and a violent tempest. There was the deafening sound of a trumpet and a voice so overwhelmingly dreadful that the people begged for the audio to stop.
Even Moses, the great leader, confessed, "I exceedingly fear and quake." If even an animal accidentally brushed against the base of the mountain, it was to be executed.
So Sinai is the ultimate architecture of fear and exclusion. It is a system built on distance, boundaries, and the absolute terrifying holiness of God, incompatible with human frailty.
It demands perfection under the threat of immediate annihilation. But then the author executes a breathtaking pivot. He says to the readers, "But ye are come unto Mount Zion."
He tells them they've relocated. So what does the architecture of Zion look like?
It is the total inversion of Sinai. Zion is the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. Instead of blackness and tempest, it is populated by an innumerable company of angels in a state of festal, joyful gathering.
It is the General Assembly and Church of the Firstborn.
But the absolute center of gravity in Zion, the reason it differs from Sinai, is found in verse 24. "And to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling, that speaketh better things than that of Abel."
Oh, that callback to Abel is stunning. We discussed Abel in chapter 11, the first martyr.
Right. In the Genesis story, Abel's blood cries out from the ground, demanding justice and vengeance against his murderer. It is a cry for retribution.
But the author argues that the blood of Jesus, the mediator, speaks a fundamentally different language. It cries out for mercy, pardon, and reconciliation. It absorbs the vengeance.
Precisely. Sinai was an exclusionary system driven by terror. Zion is an inclusionary system driven by grace and mediated access.
So the author is essentially asking the persecuted readers, why would you possibly abandon the joyful open access of Zion to relapse back into the terrifying exclusionary shadows of Sinai?
But the author is very careful not to let grace devolve into casual apathy. There is a need for deep discernment here. Zion is joyful, but it is not frivolous.
No, the text immediately reinstates a sense of awe. It warns them not to refuse the one who is speaking. It notes that at Sinai, God's voice merely shook the earth.
But the promise of the new covenant is a final cosmic shaping. God says, "Yet once more I shake not the earth only, but also heaven."
What's the purpose of that?
The purpose of this universal seismic event is to remove all the things that are made. The temporary political institutions, the flawed economic systems, the superficial cultural narratives, so that only the unshakable things remain.
It is an apocalyptic filtration system. Only the eternal survives. And the chapter concludes with a phrase that shatters any illusion of attained theology. For our God is a consuming fire.
Grace does not extinguish the fire of God's holiness. It allows us to survive it. Therefore, the required response to this grace is not casual indifference, but profound reverence and godly fear.
We are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, so we must serve God acceptably.
If we pull this massive theological architecture down to the level of human psychology, it presents a profound diagnostic test for modern motivation.
Look at what drives your daily behavior. Are you motivating yourself from Mount Sinai? Are you driven by a constant low-grade terror of failure? Is your career fueled by anxiety?
Is your parenting driven by perfectionism and the fear of judgment? That is Sinai energy.
It might produce temporary results, but it will eventually crush you. Or are you operating from Mount Zion? Are you driven by a deep sense of gratitude for grace?
Is your work an expression of joyful community? Are you motivated by the security of an unshakable kingdom?
The mountain you choose to live on dictates the endurance of your soul.
That diagnostic test perfectly sets up the final movement of the letter. Because the author has just taken his readers to the absolute outer limits of cosmic theology, unshakable universes, consuming fires, heavenly cities, and in chapter 13, he brings them crashing back down to Monday morning.
This is where the blueprint actually hits the dirt. We move into the radical everyday wisdom of Hebrews 13.
Right, because if you are a citizen of the heavenly, unshadable Zion, how does that actually alter your behavior when you are stuck in rush hour traffic or dealing with a difficult neighbor or balancing your checkbook?
The transition from the cosmic to the mundane is intentionally jarring. Chapter 13 is a rapid-fire sequence of highly practical, ethical commands.
It begins with the foundation of the community. Let brotherly love continue. But it immediately pushes that love outside the comfort zone of the known group.
Verse 2 says, "Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares."
He is referencing the ancient stories of Abraham and Lot, who offered hospitality to travelers who turned out to be divine messengers. But in the first century context, this was a highly dangerous command.
Extremely dangerous. These Christians were under surveillance. They were being persecuted.
The safest, most logical survival tactic would be to close ranks, lock the doors, and trust absolutely no one outside the immediate circle. A stranger knocking on the door could be an informant or a Roman soldier.
But the ethic of Zion demands radical hospitality. It demands vulnerability in the face of threat.
Then the text moves from hospitality to profound empathy. Verse 3 commands, "Remember them that are in bonds, as bound with them, and them which suffer adversity, as being yourselves also in the body."
This is not the superficial performative sympathy we often see today, where we post a sad emoji on social media and move on with our day. The text demands visceral identification.
You must neurologically and emotionally project yourself into the prison cell of your brother. You must feel the weight of their chains on your own wrists. Why? Because you share the same spiritual body. Their suffering is structurally your suffering.
He then addresses the integrity of the most intimate human architecture, marriage. Marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled. But whoremongers and adulterers God will judge.
In a Roman culture that was famously promiscuous and treated marital fidelity as somewhat optional for men of status, this was a severe boundary line. It demands keeping covenants in a world that treats commitments as disposable.
But the next ethical command is perhaps the most difficult one for our current era to digest. Verse 5 tackles the economy of the soul. "Let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as ye have. For he hath said, I will never leave thee, nor forsake thee."
We have to unpack this because our entire modern civilization is practically engineered to violate this specific verse.
The multi-trillion-dollar advertising industry, the algorithm of every social media platform, the entire structure of consumer capitalism is all fundamentally built on manufacturing covetousness.
It is designed by behavioral psychologists to make you look at your current life, your current car, your current body, and feel a deep, agonizing discontentment so that you will execute a transaction to medicate that pain.
In our culture, contentment is not just a nice attitude, it is a radical countercultural act of defiance.
It is economic rebellion. But the author doesn't just command stoic detachment. He doesn't say, just be happy with less. He grounds the capacity for contentment in a specific ironclad promise from God. I will never leave thee, nor forsake thee.
Matthew Henry points out a linguistic masterpiece, hidden in the original Greek of this verse, actually.
Oh, the 5 negatives.
Yeah. To convey the absolute certainty of this promise, the Greek text layers 5 overlapping negatives. A literal translation would sound grammatically absurd in English. I will never, no, not ever, no, never leave you.
It is the most emphatic assertion of permanent divine presence possible in the language.
The psychological mechanism here is brilliant. You don't defeat the anxiety of covetousness by simply trying to desire less money. You defeat it by decoupling your foundational sense of security from your fluctuating bank account and reattaching it to the unbreakable 5 negative promise of the creator of the universe.
If the unshakable God is permanently with you, the urgency to hoard temporary resources evaporates.
That stability of the soul naturally carries over into the stability of the mind. In verse 9, the author warns, Be not carried about with diverse and strange doctrines. For it is a good thing that the heart be established with grace, not with meats, which have not profited them that have been occupied therein.
This specific historical issue here was the early Christians getting dragged back into obsessive debates over Jewish dietary laws and ceremonial meats. But the underlying pathology is timeless.
We love the churn of new information. We are easily seduced by diverse and strange doctrines. Today, it isn't ceremonial meats. It is the endless carousel of self-help gurus, new manifestation techniques, obscure internet conspiracy theories, or hyper-niche dietary cults.
We obsess over the micromechanics of these strange doctrines, hoping they will fix us.
And the text dismisses all of that noise with a single grounding truth. It is grace that establishes the heart.
The endless pursuit of the novel and the strange is ultimately unprofitable. True stability is found in the simple, profound reality of divine grace.
And to maintain that stability, the author addresses the structure of authority within the community. Verse 17 says, "Obey them that have the rule over you, and submit yourselves, for they watch for your souls, as they that must give account. They may do it with joy, and not with grief, for that is unprofitable for you."
Again, we need to apply a heavy dose of discernment here.
Right. In an era where we've seen countless documentaries exposing toxic, abusive leaders in various institutions, a command to obey and submit sets off massive alarm bells. This cannot be read as a mandate for blind authoritarianism or cult-like subjugation.
Absolutely not. Matthew Henry provides crucial guardrails for interpreting this. The submission described here is a cooperative, relational dynamic designed for communal harmony.
So it's not about power.
No, the leaders are to be followed specifically because their lives demonstrate the truth of the gospel and because they carry the terrifying burden of watching out for the souls of the community, a task for which they will face divine judgment.
It is a relationship built on trust and mutual accountability, not tyranny.
If a leader abandons the truth or abuses the flock, the mandate for obedience dissolves. But the text warns against a perpetually rebellious, unteachable spirit. Constantly fighting legitimate, loving leadership causes grief for the leaders, and ultimately, the text warns, it is unprofitable and destructive for the individual.
As the letter draws to a close, the author synthesizes everything we have discussed. The blueprint of faith, the endurance of the arena, the training of the Father, the grace of Zion, and the radical ethics of the community into one final, deeply provocative image.
It is the defining call to action of the entire book. In verses 11 through 14, the author references the ancient sacrificial system.
How so?
Under the law, the bodies of the animals whose blood was brought into the sanctuary for sin were taken completely outside the camp and burned. The space outside the camp was the place of the unclean, the rejected, and the outcast.
And the author then connects this to Jesus. Wherefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered without the gate.
Jesus was not crucified in the center of the temple. He was executed on a garbage dump outside the city walls, dying the death of a marginalized criminal. He was the ultimate outcast.
And because the Savior was rejected by the cultural and religious center of his day, the author issues this final haunting command to the readers. Let us go forth therefore unto him without the camp, bearing his reproach. For here have we no continuing city, but we seek one to come.
If we really unpack the sociological weight of that phrase, outside the camp, it is devastating to our desire for comfort.
The camp represents safety. It represents the culturally approved consensus. It represents the applause of the crowd, the security of the established institutions, and the warmth of the in-group. We all want to be inside the camp.
But the text argues that the truth is no longer inside the camp. The truth is hanging on a cross outside the gate.
To stand with the truth, to align yourself with the unshakable kingdom, you have to voluntarily exile yourself from the comfort of the consensus. You have to be willing to be misunderstood, marginalized, and mocked by the very society you were trying to survive in. You have to bear his reproach.
It perfectly loops back to where we started.
Abraham lived in tents because he was looking for a city with foundations. Moses left the palace of Egypt to suffer affliction in the desert. Noah built a boat while the world laughed.
They all stepped outside the camp.
The ultimate test of the blueprint, the final proof that you actually believe the unseen is real, is your willingness to walk away from the visible security of the current culture. Because this world, with all its wealth, its status, and its fragile institutions, is not our permanent home.
We have no continuing city here. We are seeking the one to come.
The challenge remains exactly the same today as it was in the first century. Are you willing to drop the weights, endure the training, and step outside the gate?
That's the question you have to answer.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.